to symbolize what it means to pass along, and really that's the analogy. The verse that's on here, 2 Timothy 2:2, where Paul says basically take what's been given to you and pass it along to other qualified men and women, and that's the order of how the church exists and continues to exist. So this one was given to me. Actually, Ted Johnston and Jeb Egbert signed this when I was given leadership over the camp ministry. It was handed off, and so this is a keepsake that I put on my shelf in the office. And in our relationship too, I thought this would be a good way to introduce ourselves. I spent a couple years with Bill here from 2003 to 2005. Bill actually gave me a plaque. Jonathan never gave me a plaque, but Bill did, and it was really a cool thing. And I like what Bill said. He said, "Mentor for a season and a friend for life," and that was a real good statement. And so these are in my office back at the house, and I thought this is a great way to introduce. So I just brought these little pieces along. But Bill, we're gonna start with the question about the relationship of how did it actually come about? How did we begin the relationship of pastor, mentor, and the trainee-mentee type relationship?
I think it was gradual. My wife and I, this was before we had children, my wife and I were traveling down to your church in Fayetteville, North Carolina, and we were helping to lead some worship and kind of share some of the things that we had learned about modern contemporary worship with the worship team there. And as a result, I guess the first thing to say is a year prior at Campbell University at summer camp. It was the first year of the regional camps. In the course of ministering there, and my function was just to play the guitar and sing on the worship team, and Paul David Kurtz, who is now the director of Higher Ground Summer Camp, came to me and said, "Have you ever thought about being in pastoral ministry? I think you are being called to pastoral ministry." And I was dismissive. And then through the experience of leading worship in Fayetteville, that's when you and I began to dialogue about the possibility of an internship and my calling. I think you had identified that there was a calling as well, and my wife had too. Davina had identified that calling before I was willing to admit it, and I say this somewhat tongue-in-cheek, but it's more serious than not, that often, in my experience, the voice of the Holy Spirit sounds a lot like my wife's voice.
Yeah, exactly.
And God just opened every door and made the whole process. I mean, we both had to leave our jobs. I remember my employer offering me more money to stay at my job. We left our jobs, we sold our home, we moved to Fayetteville, we bought another home that we knew we would possibly stay in for only 2 years. It worked out that way. We lived there 2 years and moved, but that's kind of how we got started. Was in that situation, the mentor identified the person being called to ministry and then was intentional in mentoring that person into that role.
Very good, very good. And I would echo that too, because really we built a relationship more through the camp ministry, and then you started coming to the congregation periodically. And there was a little bit of recruiting on my part, but at the same time you were hearing different voices around you just expressing that they see something in your life where God's calling you to ministry. So that's good, and I appreciate, even in Bill's case, of being willing to uproot and even take a lesser pay. I mean, that's really commendable, and that's the journey of ministry is a lot like that. So we don't need to sugarcoat it. It kind of looks like that. Well, Jonathan, a little bit of a different story with you and how we got involved in the relationship.
Yeah, I would say mine would be the example of the other primary way that it works. Bill, described it as the mentor, bringing him into that. The other direction it can go is when an individual feels a calling and is seeking out mentorship. So all my life, at least as far back as I can remember, I'd had a desire to be involved in pastoral ministry, especially in preaching and teaching. As a child, I thought about it. But because of the circumstances of the church and the way I was raised, I had this erroneous idea that I couldn't volunteer for that role. I had to wait to be chosen. So after I left college, I moved into Greg's area, to go to law school. And during that first year of law school, I realized that I did have a sense of calling, and that it was permissible for me to stand up, so to speak, within the church and say, you know, I feel called to this. So Greg and I sat down, and I think that's one thing that I would say to anyone who's already in a role of ministry. You really need to be open to listen to people when they say, I like your ministry and I would like to be involved in your ministry. And that was what was so wonderful about where Greg was at that time and the way the Spirit used him in my life, because at that very fragile moment, if Greg had said, well, you know, you spend a few years here in the church and then we'll see, or, you know, how arrogant, you know, his response could have crushed that at that moment. And the Holy Spirit led him in exactly the right response to welcome me into that relationship. And one thing I would say to people who are in ministry, if you think about yourself as a potential mentor, realize that it's not up to you to be a gatekeeper. Somebody comes to you and says, I feel like I want to be a pastor. You don't have to figure out in the next 2 weeks, is that person really supposed to be a pastor? Bring them, put your arm around them, bring them alongside them, let them start participating. And believe me, it will become clear to everyone, including the person, whether that's a good role for them or not. So you don't have to, as a mentor, you don't have to feel like it's your responsibility to get this thing figured out.
Right.
It's your responsibility to enter into loving relationship to try to help that mentee.
Absolutely, and that leads into another question, because part of what happens, you're speaking to the issue of the formality of the relationship, and there's something to be said for structure as well. But I think it's a balance of the two. I think there's a real sense of life on life. You know, Jesus basically invited the disciples, you know, come and be with me. You know, and they didn't necessarily have a planned out day. You know, a lot of times ministry happened as they were journeying along the way. I don't think he set up the fig tree to say, I've got a real cool story, and once I get them over here, you know, they happened on the fig tree, and then it was a teachable moment. So let's talk a little bit about some of the practical experience. We'll get to PD here in a minute too. And PD and my relationship, we spent time more in working in the camp environment of a camp director and then the assistant director who eventually took over as well. And we're going to let PD talk about his experience of mentoring a younger person here in a minute as well. But let's talk a little bit about the life-on-life experiences that you guys had. What were some of the parts of the journey that really really helped toward your development? And let Bill go first.
I'd say the golf.
Yeah.
I mean that sounds funny, but the times when you and I would go and play golf together. I mean that's okay. Traditionally, it's about 3 hours to play around the golf, and I know there were times when we had very little time to do it, and we could get it in 2 or 2.5. Playing
golf.
Speed golf, playing speed golf. But it was a great opportunity for playing golf and being outdoors and sharing something like that together is relational. And when there is instruction, especially if it's correction, it's a great atmosphere. Not just golf, but anything, any context of relationship is a very disarming way of correcting someone, because you don't feel threatened. You're not backed into a corner. And I remember going into the internship. You might remember this. One of the very first things I said to you was, I don't want to be your intern unless you can agree to be brutally honest with me. And
you regret saying that, I'm sure.
Man. About brutal.
Yeah, about 6 months into the thing, one morning.